Hello. Welcome back to YouTube's most practical comic book creation channel. Right before we get into the comic cover art, right? Probably the most important, part of it is probably the second most important part, which is the branding of the book, the titling, right? And it depends really on what exactly the name of it is, right? There's the most iconic books in the world have a very distinguishable logo, and it fundamentally goes down into the idea of, it's typography, it's lettering, it's the idea of what will this be called, what will people refer to this, and what is the image that first comes to mind when you say the name, right? Whenever I say the X-Men, you already have 1,000 images pop into your head, and one of them is probably the most iconic comic book logo in the world. One of the other most consistent logos I've probably seen is Superman, right? There's a couple of different ones throughout the years, especially with Batman. There's 1,000 iterations of that iconic logo. Probably one of my favorite ones was when Neil Adams, right, the late and great Neil Adams, I actually got a chance to meet him once at a convention. I was able to shake his hand, and we spoke a little bit briefly on Green Lantern and Green Arrow, and he told me this was one of the books that really revolutionized the comic book format. And even that has its own kind of typography and design elements whenever it was being distributed, right? Because it was something different. They didn't want it to just be the same. They were like, well, this is its own thing, but we don't know really what to call it. Let's just put both of the names on there. Our book here, you're going to see a little bit of the previews of the final comic book cover art, but you have to be able to work back and forth, right? It's integral. You could see I literally stopped dead in my tracks as soon as I realized, oh yeah, I didn't design the title yet. That's super important. So I jumped back in there and I made sure it was all spaced out, because you kind of have to give it enough space, enough, breathing room. And if you're overlapping, you kind of need to, give it enough space for it to still be readable, even though it has images over top of it. So my goal with it was to kind of have the old school graffiti letters, right? The bubble font, right? But obviously I'm making it from scratch. I'm doing it, from my own hands. It's the process. Nothing here is AI generated on Farlook Studios. Nothing here is ever stolen or forged. You have to remember it's always original, right? So I wanted to really hone in that spray paint kind of grungy look. My art style is very specific, very retro and vintage, but I've always been influenced by street art, right? Living in Miami, we have the beautiful area of Wynwood. Maybe not always beautiful, but it definitely has the gorgeous paintings and murals and spray painting all over the walls in downtown, right? And I always loved the graffiti letters. So whenever I get the chance to pull out my bubble font, right, which I'm so fond of, I feel like no one really knows how to do bubble letters just as good as I do them. So it's a little bit of a flex, right? I wanted to have it, the character's called Bubble Boy. Let's use the bubble font, right? So I wanted to have this kind of grungy street look, but keeping it cartoony, bouncy, and retro, right? As soon as you read it, when you slide from left to right, it kind of, there's a liveliness to it, right? Traditional comics always have some sort of like undershadow, some sort of undertone, or some sort of, it's always the same color or something underneath, right? And I kind of wanted to do that, but I wanted to do it differently. I think one of the best examples I can give in terms of like what I mean by the undershadow or the overlay or whatever of the titles, it's probably Secret Wars is the one that utilizes it to a super iconic degree. And I think the old school Captain America, right, from like the Golden Age period, they all used all the retro eerie comics, right, Tales from the Crypt, all the EC stuff from like the Golden Age and Silver Age and stuff. That whole era was really integral for typography and font design, because it would be the stuff that you would whenever your book is up on the racks traditionally, right, you would only see like the upper half, the top half. And that's actually why the corner box art in Marvel was invented by Steve Ditko when he was making Spider-Man. They wanted it to, still show up as like, oh, this is the guy who's going to be in the book. It's like a tiny little cover of who's going to be inside the book, right on the top left. We're going to go into that a little bit in the cover art design, but I just wanted to say the first third of the book, right, the upper half of the book is probably the most important part, because even when you're looking not only through the racks or on the walls and stuff, but when you're looking at the comics that are stacked into the short boxes, the long boxes, and within comic shops, you're gonna only pull out probably the first inch and then keep thumbing through and finding other covers. If the font doesn't attract your attention, then we've got a big problem here. It's one of the most important aspects, probably one of the most important things, right? It's almost as important as a cover, so I just needed to go over that briefly, right? You have to really think about what it is, the aesthetic, what it is, the story you're trying to tell. And I just kind of wanted to cement this logo to almost go hand in hand with the character's design. I basically just drew the character, right, giving him the little iconic, the little nub on his head. I gave that to all of the letter B's, basically to signify him, right? The same way that Batman always utilizes the B's and that the Superman especially utilizes the S in super. I wanted my character to have the kind of, that same little bubble aesthetic that he has whenever I draw the actual character. Like, let's say if I were to turn the logo into a suit, then I could just use that as a superhero suit. However, my guy doesn't have a traditional costume per se, at least not in this format, at least not in this issue. I wanted to have this kind of like punk rock, graffiti, grungy kind of aesthetic, specifically for this one, just because I wanted Bubble Boy to not seem so cartoony or childish. I wanted it to be like, hey, this could be something people of all ages could enjoy. This looks kind of tough. I kind of like how this looks, right? I kind of like playing with zipatones. I love the old school kind of like halftones. And for those who don't know what I'm referring to here, it's the comic book dots, right? They're called the Ben-Day dots. And Zipatone, all that stuff is like the old school companies that used to actually manufacture it. We would have to cut it out with an X-Acto knife to put it exactly where we wanted, right? The old school comic book legends would be doing it by hand, remember? Thankfully, we're doing it all digitally, so we don't have to worry about that. And I just like placing it to give it some sort of depth, right? Some sort of value, right? A different element to it, right? So that we know what's on top and what's below, right? It gives it a layered quality, and it kind of gives it even more of that grungier cartoon comic book aesthetic, right? I'm really going for a pop art kind of energy. I wanted it to be something like even just the name alone could be framed and put on a wall somewhere. I could literally just have it stand as an art piece on its own. And one of the things I absolutely love, there's book editor, right? Chip Kidd. He's done stuff for Frank Miller's Dark Knights. I think he did it for Watching the Watchmen, right? Which is the how-to, right, behind the scenes book. I spoke about that briefly on the last episode. If you haven't seen that one, please go check it out. It's really insightful. So this guy, right, this editor, Chip Kidd, he would basically, his aesthetic would be to just blow up panels to a massive size. He literally re-released the Fantastic Four, but just every single panel was an entire page, right? So it was the first issue expanded upon, and that kind of gives you an idea that, wow, so Kirby was really making each individual panel stand on its own, almost telling its own story, panel to panel. And frankly, I think that the early Marvel team really did well in terms of not only emphasizing the artwork within the books, but emphasizing the importance of the cover art. If you could go back to the old school Marvel stuff, again, we're going to go further into cover art next issue, the next episode. So please stay tuned for part 5. I think we're on, right? Part 5 is coming out next. I actually think that the old school Marvel logos are something to pay attention to. Because we kind of take it for granted. We're reading the book, we're kind of just flipping through. We don't realize that there is a hand that is designing these fonts, these logos. Think about how iconic the old school Avengers logo is, right? It's something that we disregard, right? The modern one is literally almost a direct adaptation to the original design. That's impressive that a simple, letter font has lasted over so many years, and the only difference they did was put a little arrow in the A. Everything else has practically stayed the same. Now that's iconic. That's a logo that could stand on its own. Think about it. Branding is not only for the book you're making, but it's for merchandise. Think about how that letter A of the Avengers is literally on everything, from t-shirts to mugs to posters. It's on wallpapers of people's laptops. It's on stickers. It's, I think titles are probably more important than we often think. And, lettering is often disregarded as probably the most boring part of comic book making. Right? I'm not going to be the guy who letters every page. I'm not going to be the guy who letters every dialogue balloon or every text box in the comic itself. I thankfully made my own font for that. However, I do think that every word on the title, every word on the front half of the cover needs to be original, right? Because this is important for the section that says the adventures of. I mean, not just that name alone implies a retro kind of story, but I wanted to give it an old school pen, old school ink brush kind of aesthetic, so that it looks like it's just leaning into the grungy factor of it, right? That kind of street art, kind of pop art, wave that really took over New York in the early 70s and 80s. I think even it lasted all the way up to this day, till the 90s as well, and all the way up till even now. We're returning to digital format. We're going back to the aesthetics that were found within those periods, right? By Andy Warhol, by Basquiat, and all of these other artists, right? Especially Keith Haring, I think, is a very comic book inspired illustrator. There's a lot of graphic elements to it that I think we've kind of lost with time. Modern comics don't have the same quality, and one of the only artists that really comes to mind in terms of street art within comic books, right, is the late and great, rest in peace, Ed Piskor from the Cartoonist Kayfabe. His Hip Hop Family Tree books had some of the best graffiti art within comics. He had a real passion for it, and I remember hearing interviews and watching videos about him describing how he would literally just be drawing tags that he would see around his hometown in Pittsburgh. He would literally just be walking around, take mental note of who are the local artists, right? In Miami we have our own set of artists, but it's not as distinct, right? We have Atomic, we have a couple other guys. I think I actually met one of it's some ghost or something. I forgot his name, but there's definitely a scene for it, and I think integrating it into the comic books is an important way to keep it alive, because graffiti is its own rebellious art form, born out of necessity, born out of kind of just the innocence of art making itself, right? The risk takers of society just needed to get this out into the world and mark their territory and just show that they've been here, Sometimes there's reasons for why the artist places it on an exact spot, an exact location, right? We go all the way up to the most unattainable areas, the most dangerous, risky areas with, broken, dilapidated buildings, and, where you might have to fight off a homeless person or something. It's dangerous. Don't get me wrong. You have to go and reach up to high spots where you might fall, right? The police might stop you. It's crazy, right? So I have a huge respect for street artists, and I just kind of wanted to put a little bit of my love for that on the cover of this book. It has nothing to do with street art, but I think it definitely captures the aesthetic I'm going for, and I get to represent my passion for that kind of medium, right? We seem to realize, we seem to have forgotten that it's its own art form, it's its own, beautiful kind of way of expressing yourself through words, through symbols, right? Some of them is just literally groups of teens just having fun. It's not all violence, it's not all crime. Some of it's honestly pretty mundane. Here I wanted to experiment a little bit with colors. I wanted to have something that pops, right? Whenever you're making a title, you have to remember the actual cover art is going to change colors drastically, but the logo is more or less going to stay the same. And I wanted to have something that stays pretty consistent here. I was experimenting with a couple of the blue shades. I didn't really mess with it too much. I definitely liked how the red, pink, and white looked, so I kind of ended up going with something a little less weird, because the blues just didn't work. You can see here I'm experimenting with the actual top half of the letters, right? The Adventures of had to look drastic and dramatic as well. I'm playing with the shadows and the overlays and the under shadows and stuff. I wanted to have it be, I wanted it to pop. I wanted it to kind of grab people's attention. Like, if I see this, it looks so different from everything that modern comics stand for. I'm so tired of the boring computer generated, it's just heavy grays and navy blues and dark purples and browns, all these muddy dark colors for comic books. I don't like it. I don't care for it. Frankly, it's just not engaging to me. I've actually kind of fallen in love with there's this series that Marvel put out, and it's the blacklight posters. I have a couple of them in my actual studio. The blacklight posters from Kirby and other Marvel artists like Romita and all that, or Ditko themselves, or Buscema, right? All of these acclaimed artists, right, in their own respect. But the way that they reprinted these was literally just these blacklight colors that were just pop. And the moment I saw these little note cards, I was like, damn, why don't comic book covers look like this stuff? Why isn't there a run of just Fantastic Four with the Kirby covers but blacklight edition? Like, that would be so cool. I remember, again, from Cartoonist Kayfabe, there was an entire comic book made by Jim Rugg that was in blacklight. Probably the first blacklight comic, I think it was called Octobriana. And man, that stuff looks stellar. He even did like the Hulk, right, and his Hulk grand design, and it was like this neon green. And I was like, man, what happened to all these, amazing bold colors in comic books, right? There was such a history of that stuff, and I wanted to kind of bring that back in a different way. You can see here I'm kind of experimenting it. I wanted to have just that solid block of yellow. So I wanted to make sure that the title itself, pops whenever in contrast to such a strong color. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Please comment, like, subscribe, and put notifications on to stay updated. Check out my self-published book on Amazon titled Junket: Hidden Worlds Revealed Part 1. I'm also live streaming on Twitch, where you could see behind the scenes of me actually making the artwork from scratch. Go ahead and follow me on Instagram to stay up to date with everything that I'm doing art-wise, and thank you guys so much. Peace out.